just kind of watching him just go about his life, really. Like growing up, I sort of absorbed the engineer mindset. In his mind, like the point of life is to figure things out, and problems are there to be solved. And the whole thing is by applying yourself the right way, you can solve that. And I think sort of that's the biggest piece of mentoring I think I got kind of implicitly, right? Like the idea that the problems are out there and that you could solve them if you just apply yourself, I think is the thing that attracts, I think, all of us to engineering fundamentally.
Making sense of specialized engineering knowledge is not easy. A majority of the technical know-how is actually learned informally on the job and by doing. If you're fortunate enough, you've had an incredible mentor who's shown you the tricks of the trade. If not, don't worry about it, because this podcast will serve as your own personal tribe of mentors. In each episode, we will extract tribal knowledge from top engineering and manufacturing leaders to help you on your journey. There's really no way of knowing what information you're going to need around the next corner of your career. So let grinding gears be your guide.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Grinding Gears podcast. I'm your host, Bassanio Peters, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Agustin Lebron. Agustin, can you share a little bit about your background? Specifically, you got your EE, correct?
Yeah, that's right, Bassanio. Thanks for having me on the show. I think this is great. Yeah, so I got my my degree in electrical engineering many years ago, and computer engineering as well. And yeah, I started my career as an engineer. I was a chip designer for many years. I designed chips for cell phones, GPS receivers, that kind of thing, the radio front ends for those things.
Okay, great. And I mean, it's interesting how we kind of met. I was thinking about this before we joined the podcast. We were in line for, I can't remember the name of the event, but San Diego kind of meet and greet for startup community.
Right.
And we were in line and just kind of sparked up a conversation and kind of been in contact ever since. But tell me a little bit more about your background. I know right now you're angel investor at Tech Coast Angels. You're also founder and managing director of your own organization. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing currently. And then I guess it's really interesting when people get their start in engineering and then kind of transition into different stages of their career, how they got there. So
Sure.
Can you kind of talk about how you navigated the process? Because it seems like, you know, you have a very, very unique and interesting background that can provide a lot of value for organizations and people in general. So that's why I wanted to have you on the show to share a little bit about your knowledge.
Sure. Yeah. So like you said, I was an engineer. I was an engineer for many years. And back when I was an engineer, I was playing a lot of online poker back when that was profitable and debatably legal. And so I was looking for a job. Kind of engineering was getting a little bit stale, maybe, and we can talk about that a little bit later. And so I was looking for a job that was kind of combining engineering and poker. And so I found quant trading. And so transitioned to a world in finance where I was a quant trader and researcher on Wall Street and in London for many years. And then 5 years ago, I came back to San Diego and started this consulting company that I now run. And what we do is basically try to bring back some of the ideas from trading back to engineering, back to tech, because I think that the tech can learn a lot from other areas of business, of the business world, certainly. And so a lot of that can come down to basically how to make better decisions. How do tech organizations and engineers in particular sort of structure their work in a way that lets them make better and better decisions?
Right. Okay. So now I want to take a step back to what you said initially. First of all, online poker, what kind of intrigued you to get into that? And then how did that help you with the realization that for you, the engineering work kind of got stale? So how did that kind of help you with that realization?
Yeah. So the online poker, I mean, it was a big boom back when I was doing it, kind of in the early 2000s. So like everybody else, I kind of jumped into it with 2 feet. I always kind of liked playing games. I've always been kind of a competitive person. And so that's kind of what attracted me, honestly. It's just kind of this new game. And as a battle of wits, I felt like, well, let's give it a shot, right? But it's interesting that poker trains you to think in a way that maybe is somewhat unfamiliar to engineers. And I think this is a thing that we could talk about a lot. Like engineers certainly like certainty, right? Like they kind of know, they like to know what's going on. They like to sort of figure things out, right? That's kind of the fundamental thing that engineers, I think, have. But poker and certainly trading in the financial world is all about uncertainty, right? Like you can't nail down every detail. You can't figure every last thing out. And so how do you merge sort of the good training that you get as an engineer in terms of thinking about problems rationally and that kind of thing with an understanding of sort of the idea that the world is fundamentally an uncertain place?
Okay, so what's one thing that you learned through this transition and journey? Like, what's one piece of
Mhm.
tangible advice that you can give to up and coming engineer right now, or maybe someone in a senior leadership position? What's one
Sure.
piece of tangible advice through that transition that you learned?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, it sounds like a like kind of a broad thing, but I think it's actually a very specific thing, which is look, the world is a much more interesting place than you could ever imagine. People say life is short, but as far as our careers go, it's clear that it's the opposite, right? Like life is long and the world is very complex. And so there's always something new to learn and get involved in and to make a difference with. And the concrete piece of advice is sort of be open to those things, right? Like again, as engineers, it's very easy to sort of put the blinkers on and say, okay, this is the project. I'm just going to grind away on this project. And, it's sort of an easy way to go about your career. But I think sort of some of the best career advice that I've received has been of the nature of kind of look around, like pull your head up and kind of look at the bigger picture and look for opportunities where your specific skill set can be applied in a way that maybe is not narrowly an engineering role or something like that. And I think you Basani in particular could probably relate to that.
100%. Yeah, my career path has taken many twists and turns, and it kind of led me to this point. And actually, in episode one of the podcast, we talked to James Trevelyan. He's the author of The Making of an Expert Engineer. And one of the funniest things that sticks with me from that episode is he got in his career, he got started creating sheep shearing robots. And throughout this process, he learned a ton along the way. And he says you can't really look at that as, oh, this is not the kind of start I wanted to my career. Every step within your path helps you to prepare for that next stage. And one thing
Exactly.
I wanted to bring up that you kind of mentioned was, that great piece of career advice that you got, which was have your eyes open, have your head on a swivel, think about the world as far as opportunities are concerned. That sounds like you had a mentor. Who's one mentor that you can kind of point to that kind of helped you discover that path? Because I feel like that's something that is of great importance, of having a mentor, especially
Hmm.
in engineering field, and if that's your path and what you choose. But can you point to a mentor, and is that the piece of advice that they gave you that helped you most in kind of your career?
Right. Yeah. So that piece of advice I got from my first boss in my first engineering job, and he was a great boss and mentor. But I mean, I think if I think back to sort of the engineering mentor that I think has influenced me the most, it's clearly my dad. He's an engineer, or he's retired now, but he was an engineer, and just kind of watching him just go about his life. Really, like growing up, I sort of absorbed the engineer mindset. In his mind, like the point of life is to figure things out, and problems are there to be solved, and the whole thing is by applying yourself the right way, you can solve that. And I think sort of that's the biggest piece of mentoring I think I got kind of implicitly, right? Like the idea that the problems are out there and that you could solve them if you just apply yourself, I think is the thing that attracts, I think, all of us to engineering fundamentally.
Right, right. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And then that kind of leads to one of my next questions, which is, kind of tell us, not a question, but more tell us about your current role. I know you recently joined Tech Coast Angels, and then how do you apply
Hmm.
a lot of the information and the knowledge that you've obtained throughout your career and the different paths that you've taken to your decision
Sure.
making process? And what type of innovations are you personally interested in and looking at in, the future economies?
Yeah, the thing with kind of getting into this angel investing world that I think is great is in particular the growth of San Diego as a target for new companies and for investors, the investor class, I think is super exciting. It's something that you can definitely feel a momentum in the last 2 or 3 years. And as a member of TCA, obviously we're trying to enable that. And my background, I think, is obviously kind of on the engineering side, and so hopefully to the extent that companies come to us and looking for angel investing, maybe I can help kick the tires on some of the more technical stuff. And in addition, obviously, with maybe the training in finance and that sort of thing, again, especially angel investing, right? Like the vast majority of investments don't go anywhere, right? That's just the nature of the business. And so being comfortable with that level of risk and uncertainty, I think is kind of an important thing. Um, and TCA, I think, is interested in a very broad set of things. Kind of for me personally, on the tech side, the sort of thing that interests me is doing difficult things that used to require specialized software and hardware, doing that with commodity software and hardware. Like, for example, think of the Apple Watch, right? Where, this was like medical grade, or things that used to require medical grade hardware. Now you can do sort of in a watch format, or, self-driving cars with commodity LiDAR equipment. And on the software side, even like the stuff you can do with AWS Lambda, which is like super, super cheap, serverless computing. And things like that extend up and down the tech chain. And I'm kind of excited about ideas that sort of democratize, in some sense, technology.
Great. Yeah, that fits really well with what we're trying to do. For us, it's democratizing innovation, putting, I always tell everybody this is kind of not a tagline, but just what I think. Like, technology price wise has come down where, the average person has access to technologies that used to be reserved for, large government agencies and big business. And now you have these tools in your hand. And like you said, I think the opportunities to truly disrupt, and I don't really like the word disrupt, but find opportunities, like you said, have your head on a swivel, find opportunities that you can tackle, and then use the knowledge that you've acquired and obtained throughout your career and whatever that journey might be to solve a problem. Like like you alluded to with your father, it's, the world is full of opportunities to solve those problems. And it's the engineering mindset of going out and tackling it. But I wanted to dive into one part of the conversation that really sparked both of our curiosity with regards to coming on the podcast and joining us, which is, the decision-making framework that you use and the process and why more engineers can and should kind of embrace this notion. So can you first kind of take a step back and explain your kind of thought process and your decision-making process that you feel like a lot of engineers should embrace? Because I know this is part of what you do through your consulting firm.
Exactly. Yeah. So, the idea of improving decision-making is something that I'm very passionate about. And that's why I wrote the book that I wrote, which came out a few months ago, called The Laws of Trading. And sort of it's about thinking about decisions within the financial world. But the subtitle is A Trader's Guide to Better Decision-Making for Everyone. Because I really do think that everyone, and in particular engineers, can learn from the world of trading how to think about decisions a little bit better. And so in that book, I kind of distill it down to 11 easy to remember laws that sort of guide your decision-making process. They're easy to remember. So whenever you're faced with a decision, you don't have to sort of look things up in a book. You can sort of think of laws that kind of guide you and help you. And in particular, this idea, I want to go back to it, of thinking probabilistically about an uncertain future, because as I said, I think by inclination, engineers don't really like dealing with uncertainty, but that's just how the world works. So, like, let me give you an example. Let's say that this is kind of a classic thing in an engineering situation. Like, your boss comes to you and says, when is this piece of work going to be done, right? And you kind of think about it and you say, well, I'm going to say like 3 weeks. You actually haven't communicated much information at all, because your boss doesn't understand whether you're really, really sure you're going to make the 3 weeks, or whether it's like a really optimistic estimate because that's what they think you're looking for, or maybe it's just kind of a 50-50, like kind of on average, I'm going to finish it in 3 weeks. Like, you have to express the uncertainty in your estimates just as much as you have to express your estimates. And I think this is something that is very natural in trading and maybe not so natural in engineering, but I think it's super critical.
Great. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And, so I started my career in the engineering industry selling software. So I sold CAD and PLM software from
Hmm.
Siemens to SolidWorks, various different platforms. And that was typically, kind of what we hear from engineering managers and VPs is they feel like they're constantly under the gun to try and meet these deadlines. And they're relying on their teams to help kind of drive those deadlines forward and make sure that they're met. But the challenge becomes the level of transparency throughout the
Yeah.
process and understanding those things. And then again, this goes back to a previous episode of talking about calculating risk and why it's so important for engineers to calculate that risk throughout the project. So, can you talk a little bit
Hmm.
about that from your perspective? And I really like
Sure.
how you're tying in the financial world, which is what you came from, because I think that
Hmm.
that is something that from a financial world perspective, you understand this. And I think more people, more engineers in particular, can really value from this information. So can you talk to us just about, why is it so important to
Yeah.
calculate those risks and kind of some of the methods that you use? So again, some tangible advice.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, the thing is that's the deal, right? Like if you're designing something truly new, right? Then you don't have all the answers when you start and you can't really wing it. And so you have to have a plan. And having a plan means thinking about what could happen, what could go right, what could go wrong. And but you also need some estimated probabilities of the things going right and wrong, and you account for those as you go. And it seems like an obvious thing, right? You should have a plan and you should try to stick to that plan. And that plan should probably encompass a lot of different possibilities of things that might happen. But if there's one thing that I've seen in engineering organizations, is that they sort of focus on one part of that plan. It's the if things go right part of the plan. And oftentimes we're so focused on that part of the plan that we fail to think about the inevitable situations where things don't go right. And I think that that's, again, something that we can learn sort of thinking about things probabilistically, a better way to do things.
Right. And it was interesting. We taught a class, Assisted Develop, we taught a class through this incubator in Los Angeles recently. And we had everything planned out, scoped. And we get to the class. And on day one, we realized that laptops weren't loaded with the software that we needed that we were teaching the class for. So the students, a lot of them came from underrepresented backgrounds and they had no experience. Some had experience, but 60% of the class had no experience in engineering and manufacturing. And the first thing I told them is, here's your crash course. Like, stuff happens and you have to kind of mitigate those
Right.
issues. So I put some of my, trainers that I had on staff that were helping lead the class and said, hey, go help get this software installed and I'll kind of figure things out from there. And we taught a class on product development process, teaching them how to understand certain principles. But I just went back up there last week because about 12 of the 30 students were picked up for internships. One of the students just got picked up by LADWP. And I was talking to him and he's like, man, those first couple of days of the crash course was huge. Just understanding that stuff goes wrong and stuff happens and you can't
Yeah,
calculate
exactly.
all these risks up front, but it's very important to understand what could go wrong as opposed to what could go right and really understanding and navigating that. And that's honestly learned through experience, right? Like you can't
Absolutely. Experience is a great
and
teacher,
it
as you
falling
know.
on your face sometimes. So again, it's just interesting because that literally happened a few weeks back when we taught the course, and I just went back up there, and that was one of the things that to them stood out, which inevitably ended up being a bit of an issue because we had a couple of days without the laptops, but we put them on different projects and talked about problem solving and all this type of stuff. So that to me is kind of an
Hmm.
interesting segue into kind of the next part, which is what's the most effective method that you've seen, right? So there's this ability of
Yeah.
understanding that things go wrong, but again, I like to drill things down to tangible
Yeah.
advice from experience. So what's to you the most effective way to calculate some of those risks up front? Let's say it's a brand new project, brand new idea that someone's coming forward with and they're trying to develop. Like, what is step one for them in your mind based on your experience?
So I think there's sort of two or three components to this, depending on how you define them, that I think are really important in any good sort of decision making, risk planning sort of framework. One is you really do need to sort of sit down and think about all of the ways that things could go wrong. And in trading, you get so much practice at this because like good traders have a level of paranoia that is actually very healthy in trading, but in regular life would definitely have you branded as someone somewhat insane. But it's just part of the thing. Um, and so, yeah, just sort of itemizing all of the things you think could go wrong. And that's really a very creative exercise, actually. It's kind of fun, right? Once you really get into it, like, what are all the ways that this could screw up, right? So that's definitely an important thing. And then there's sort of another technique that I think is really effective, which is called the pre-mortem. I'm sure you've heard of it. Maybe some of your listeners haven't, but it's the idea that you're running this project. If I tell you that this project failed, predict to me how it failed, right? This is a sort of getting you out of your natural mode of thinking, I think is an important thing. And so you're basically listing all of these things down. And then you really do want to try to assign probabilities to all of these things, because you can come up with all sorts of crazy scenarios. But if the probability of that happening is essentially zero in your mind, then probably you shouldn't at least worry about it too much. And so you really want to sort of become quantitative about this to the extent that you can, with the understanding that your probabilities are just estimates. And so that's one sort of big picture aspect. The other big picture aspect is what people in the military do all the time, which is this idea of red teaming, right? Like the blue team kind of did all this planning and whatnot, and then you take a completely separate team that hasn't thought about the problem at all yet, and their job is just poke holes at the other team's problem. And again, the idea is you're trying to get out of your standard mode of thinking into thinking about things in a more open way.
Great. Yeah. And that was actually something that we discussed, the pre-mortem we discussed in a previous episode of the podcast, the Seven Deadly Sins of Product Development with my man, Travis Jacobs. And he talked about that because his role in the engineering field is he's an analyst, an FDA analyst, and he's a contractor, and he's worked for large organizations and thought about this and, again, through experience. So tell me about a time that you potentially avoided a serious risk, in your career, particularly if you have an example from your engineering career, by kind of using this framework and this methodology. Like, was there this, big problem that, or something that could have happened that could have took the project in the wrong direction, right, that you discovered through this process?
So it's funny, actually. The thing that I think back to the most, and I think people find at least a little bit interesting to talk about, is actually a trade that we used to do. So without getting into too much of the specifics, basically gold trades on commodity exchanges around the world. There's a big one in London, but it also trades in smaller venues, including in some sort of, I'm going to make it an unnamed Southeast Asian country, right? So like gold trades in a bunch of different countries, including some of these maybe second tier Southeast Asian countries. And so sometimes the price of gold is different between these two countries. And so a natural thing to do is to sort of buy the gold where it's cheap and transport it to the place where it's expensive and sell it there, right? It's a good trade. It's a good arbitrage. But the problem is, it's not so obvious that that's just sort of free money. And so we were kind of setting up this trade to sort of do this gold trade into and out of this small Southeast Asian country, and everything looked really good on paper. And we were kind of ready to go, but sort of you have to go through this process of thinking about what could go wrong. And then the most junior member on our team, who'd been on the job literally less than 2 months, said, "So that country, like, there's some amount of political unrest there. What are the chances that something bad happens?" And so, of course, this is a very natural thing. Like, if there's a coup d'etat in a country, the most obvious thing for the new government to do is to confiscate all the foreigners' money, right? Because they don't vote, and there's not much they can do about it. And so that's a risk that we hadn't thought about. And so, based on that thinking, sort of completely out of the blue creative thinking, we sort of adjusted how much capital we were willing to keep in that country. And sure enough, 6 months later, wow, there was a coup d'etat, and we lost all our money in that country. But it was like multiple millions of dollars less than we would have lost if this very junior person just hadn't had this kind of spur of the moment thought.
That's interesting because, again, sometimes it's just those different perspectives. And that's, again, why I feel it's so important to have diverse people on your team, whether it's, experience and diversity and experience, like you said, only a couple months on the job,
background and everything. It's proven again and again. Every study proves it. homogeneous groups make worse decisions than heterogeneous groups. It's just like a
Right.
universal fact.
Now, that leads into another really interesting part of the conversation that you and I had on the phone that sparked, like, let's get on a podcast and talk about this. And this is engineers stepping into managerial roles and how to,
Mhm.
again, make that adjustment, because oftentimes there's not this, especially with like small to medium sized businesses, there's not even some large corporations, there's not this process of grooming this engineer. They're maybe just one of the higher performing
Yeah.
people on the team, and they stepped in or thrust into this managerial role. And then they're like, crap, how do I figure this out? I knew what my role was as a designer, as an engineer, but now I'm stepping into this management role.
Mhm.
And a lot of the things that we're talking about in this conversation are extremely valuable. So, tell me a little bit more about what you feel like some of these engineers should embrace and know that step into this role. And then again, where do you go to
Yeah.
kind of find that? And is a traditional engineer even prepared for management?
No, I think the answer is definitely not. But that's okay because nobody is prepared, right? This is not really a specific engineer thing. But the problem is, I think, a little bit more acute for engineers because the skills that we cultivate, at least at first glance, are pretty orthogonal to the skills that we need to be a good manager. And I think the fundamental difference between being an engineering and being an engineering manager, and I'm going to put this in engineering terms, is that instead of trying to optimize the behavior of machines, you're optimizing the relationships between people. As a manager, your job is to be many things, right? Obviously, you're someone who tells people what to do at some level, but just as importantly, you're a coach, you're a sounding board. Sometimes you're a therapist or sometimes you're a protector, right? Kind of insulating them from the politics above you and all of these things. And the skill of being a good manager is learning which role to play at which point. And as you point out, this stuff is not stuff that you learn overnight because humans are the most complex machines that we know of. And so it takes time to learn to optimize their interactions.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely something that, again, I've seen throughout my career, just because selling software in my previous life, that was just the nature of what we did, right? We had conversations with, maybe one of the senior leaders on the CAD design team, or an engineering manager, and then someone steps into this new role and they're kind of like, well, all right, what do we kind of do next? So that's, to me, something that is important to understand. And again, I guess one of the next things that I want to talk about is how can they best prepare? I know you alluded to a lot of this, but then what are some of the key ingredients for success? Like, how does someone set themselves up to be successful in this role? So someone that maybe knows, hey, look, I'm doing well at this organization and I have aspirations to move into a management role. What are the key ingredients that they should focus on cultivating knowledge-wise that'll set them up for success?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think what you mentioned, I think, is still the number one thing. If the company that you're at does not offer explicit engineering manager training, and I would say very few companies actually do, then find a mentor. Find somebody that you think is a good engineer and good engineering manager in particular, and just cultivate that relationship. Say, look, what would you have done in this situation? And just sort of build that bridge, because that's basically what you're trying to do, is transition to a fairly different role, even though it seems on paper pretty similar. And so over time, you start to bounce ideas off and situations off this person, and you develop this rapport and you start to understand how they think. The other thing I think you can do is really immerse yourself in the literature of decision making and technical decision making. I mean, again, I'm gonna plug my book because I kind of have to. My publisher would kill me if I didn't. The Laws of Trading, but also other books like Farsighted by Stephen Johnson, I think, is an excellent book. Just came out. There's another one called The Idea Factory, which basically talks about how Bell Labs created the modern world between 1900 and 1950. There's so much really, really good information about how to organize engineers into productive teams in that book. So yeah, kind of become a reader of the history of how good engineering management has happened. And so I think with those two things, I think you're going to be
That's
in a
literally
really
the
good
next
shape.
book on my list. I have it. I already purchased it. I'm just finishing up another book, and that's like next on my list to dive in because you're the, I think, third or fourth person that's made that recommendation. So definitely something that I want to step into. And I think it's interesting because it's, again, compartmentalizing information, right? And who needs to know what. And then another thing that from the training class we did was managing those. You said humans are the most complex machines out there, and managing those relationships are so important. And not all engineers, to be honest, are suited for that because I was laughing
It's
to
true.
the class that I taught again and was talking about the battle between manufacturing engineers and mechanical engineers and the machinists versus the designers. You know, the designer may kick off a design and send it over to, as a part of their process, and their release process heads over to the machine department. And then they turn around and say, this product isn't even manufacturable. We don't have the equipment to do this. And then there's this constant battle back and forth
Hmm.
between the two of them. And one of the students was like, I think I'd want to be a manufacturing engineer because I can help be kind of that liaison between the two departments. And I explained to him that takes a
Right.
high level of communication, patience, and understanding, because as a
Yes.
designer, or an engineer that's sitting there working on this project for months on end, and then you finally hit the release button and goes through the process if they have PLM tools integrated, and you're like, oh, finally I'm finished with my work. And then they turn around and kick it back and say, no, this is wrong, here's the reasons. That is
Exactly.
naturally going to bring up some sort of emotion.
Yeah, no, I think there's sort of two important components that you've identified there that I think are worth highlighting. One is, like you said, communication, but in particular, the skill of listening. I think people think of communication as being able to express yourself clearly, and I think we give short shrift, at least maybe in our kind of American culture, to the listening part of things. Um, and in particular, one thing that I always tell new hires about communication, that sort of thing, is that listening is about trying to understand what they meant to say and not what you would have meant to say with those words. And I think those are two very different things. Um, and so the idea of sort of actively cultivating the ability to listen to people who are thinking in different ways from
Right.
you, I think is super important. Um, and the other thing that you highlighted in kind of this manufacturing versus design kind of thing is the importance of incentives in cultures and in corporate cultures in particular. There's a lot of examples of perverse incentives where on paper we're all on the same page, like trying to put out a successful product, but in practice, the micro incentives that we have work against that global incentive, and really trying to identify what is it that other people sort of get motivated by, or what are the incentives that they are subject to, and really trying to understand again how what their lives are like. I think helps you understand how to make better collective decisions. Again, I think that's a super
Right.
important skill
Tell
for
me a
any
little bit
manager.
more about the consulting practice and what you're doing there, because it seems like, a lot of this knowledge that you have acquired throughout the years, you can impart on other organizations. So tell me a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so a lot of the companies that we talk to are medium-sized companies, often software companies, but tech companies generally, that are growing fast, and they realize that they need to start acting like a somewhat bigger company, because if they keep growing the way they are, their processes just don't scale. And so, like a standard thing is, oh, we have a bug database in Jira, and well, we also have revision control, but like, we're not mining the data that we're creating. The exhaust of our work is there. That data, the information that can really inform how to optimize our behavior, and that sort of goes up and down the whole engineering organization. Is how do you use the information that you're generating through the course of your work in order to understand your process better and make it more efficient. Sometimes that can literally be as simple as, let's just kind of grab some data, put up some visualizations, toss them on a big TV screen in the break room. Things like, how many features have we shipped today or this week, or what's our bug count, what's the test coverage on our code base, kind of really motivates people to think about things in a collective sort of way. That can be a very simple thing, or it can get much more complex. But it's about sort of giving small and medium sized companies some of the abilities and insights that larger companies have.
Yeah, because I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is, these organizations, especially like you said, at that growth stage, trying to understand how to streamline their processes because, you know, this old adage in the startup world of move fast and break things. If you continue down that path as you start to rapidly scale, you're going to run into more problems. So it's trying to set up that framework. And again, if it's, an upstart company that, has a younger team, they need those experienced leaders to come in or consultants
Yeah.
to come in and help provide that guidance on how to set up this framework effectively.
Yeah, and oftentimes the CTO understands. Look, there are things that I should be doing. I just don't have time to do them. They're not a core competency of ours yet, and so if they can bring somebody in from the outside that has done this a bunch of times and just sort of help put them on the path to becoming good at it, then that saves them over time a lot of the mistakes that I made and me and my partner made over the course of our careers, right? If we can sort of give them the benefit of the mistakes we made, we can
Right,
short circuit
right.
some of
Yeah, and
that
an
pain.
example I'll give is an organization I was working with relatively recently, and having a conversation with them. They recently just started to embrace like a simulation driven product development process because they were going through, 4 to 6 iterations on their product development process. And they started thinking about like, all right, what if we analyze some of the parts earlier on instead of building this product out and then understanding, all right, we're going to run, an FEA analysis and maybe 3D print the parts towards the end to test that,
Hmm.
form fit function. A lot of times organizations wait to do that. And this was another example. And they started investigating, well, what if we really tried to drive a, product development process that was simulation driven? And recommended someone that I know very well to go in and kind of help them with that process and understand the different stages, the different things that they should be testing for within their product. And again, it was a newer and younger team that just needed some outside help and some outside expertise. So I was able to point someone in the right
Right.
direction. So we're kind of wrapping up here, but I wanted to, just kind of get some feedback from you on what are some of the things that you're most excited for right now, as respect to technology you see
Hmm.
out there, an industry that you feel like is about to pop or is really booming? Like, what are some of the things that you're most excited about?
Yeah. Well, so one thing is, as I said before, doing sort of difficult things with cheap hardware and cheap software. I think the idea of democratizing the process of building super quality products, I think, is super exciting and will continue to be. Um, More specifically, I think maybe something that might be surprisingly under the radar for people. My more recent background is more sort of machine learning and that kind of thing. Is the developments in the last, we'll say, 9 to 10 months in natural language processing are incredible. We're There's been kind of an inflection point in machines' ability to process natural language, and I think we're on the cusp of some really interesting and important developments in how machines understand large amounts of documents, conversations, all sorts of things. And I can imagine dozens and dozens of possible startups around some of these new technologies that have just come out in the last few months. And the third category I would say is ed tech. I think ed tech is sort of a big kind of buzzwordy sort of area. But I think the reason that it's sort of hypey is because people haven't really done it well yet. And yet the promise of ed tech, like very personalized instruction, is just as great as it's ever been. And I'm super bullish on anybody that has great ideas on how to basically personalize and really narrow target education and the improvement of skill
Right. Yeah. We're
obtention.
personally taking a stab at that with our mentor program, at Assist to Develop, where we're trying to take that tribal knowledge from senior experts and pass it on to the next generation through our platform where they work
Hmm.
together on projects. So, if you think about it, a lot of organizations, or even a small startup may not have the budget to pay someone here in the States. Typically they go overseas and, you
Yeah.
know, I've dealt with several overseas developers throughout my path and my journey, and some good, some not so good. It really just depends. And I started thinking about it and I'm like, well, damn, there's a skills gap in engineering manufacturing. There's a lot of work going overseas. organizations are complaining that these kids that are graduating school only are coming out with theoretical knowledge. And then the students are like, but every job posting we see
Yep.
says you need to have X amount of experience. So what we started thinking about was like, okay, well, what if instead of sending that work overseas, like let's say for CAD design, instead of sending that work overseas, you work with the student, recent graduate, they have an opportunity to get some hands-on experience, but then we partner that student with the mentor. And that mentor can pass on that tribal knowledge. It can be in
Yeah.
his nights and weekends, maybe someone that's set to retire. And through our collaborative platform and in the system, you have the ability to basically share that knowledge with him, work on these projects together. The students get a lower rate that, the company may have paid overseas, and they're happy because they get tangible work to show on their resume. And then the organization
Yeah.
gets the benefits of the cheaper costs. And then the mentor gets their hourly rate per hour for the project, but they're just logging in, kind of verifying the student's work. And maybe it's a couple hours a week on the project. And, next thing you know, we have this mentorship program that can help kick off some of this, as I say, knowledge sharing, which is extremely important. So that's not necessarily a stab at ed tech. It's for us just trying to say, how can we help to solve this problem? And a lot of work goes overseas
Right.
because there's not a ton of affordable alternatives. And the reality is a lot of small companies just maybe don't have the budget to pay someone a higher dollar amount if they're just getting
Absolutely.
started. So that's just something interesting that I wanted to talk about as, again, like you said, plug in the book. I got to plug. That's something new. So we're looking for top mentors to join the platform. This is something that we're going to be rolling out in the next couple of months. So Augustine, yeah, it's exciting
sounds really cool.
because again, I know we have a list of some senior experts that everybody wants to, especially in engineering, a lot of people want to give back because they had that mentor that kind of showed them the way. So, and if you can monetize your time, it makes even more sense. So Augustine, thank you again. Appreciate the conversation. I'm just as excited as you are about the tech scene here in San Diego. It's really starting to boom, really starting to take off. So excited to see what comes forward. And to all of our listeners, I will have Augustine's contact information in the show notes. So if you want to reach out, you have any questions, you have a direct line, and then where can they find your book?
They can find my book on Amazon. It's The Laws of Trading. There's also a website, lawsoftrading.com. I've got some cartoons there that kind of explain the ideas of the book. And I'm also on Twitter, Agustin Lebron 3. So drop me a note. Let's start a conversation.
Awesome. Thanks again. And we'll have all this contact information in the show notes. Till next time, everyone.